Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Lee. Lee, for everyone out there listening, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Lee McIntyre, and I'm a philosopher, and I'm a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. And I'm very interested in the problems of science denial and these days, the problem of disinformation and how that contributes to science denial.
And that leads to where I kind of found you a little bit dealing with disinformation. I feel like the general public is looking for a place to go. The general public is looking for answers, much like myself. It's kind of why I have a show to invite people on to really talk about stuff as well, too. Now, when we talk about disinformation, what specifically, I would say, do you focus on with disinformation?
The most important thing with disinformation is to note the difference between misinformation and disinformation. People can be misinformed. There can just be mistakes, accidents out there, things that we think are true, but they turn out not to be true, but we believe them anyway. The important thing when we're misinformed is that we can change our mind based on new evidence. You know, if we've got a doubt and that doubt's based on something that's not true, but we're rational human beings who are willing to change our mind based on evidence, then we can overcome that. The real problem is disinformation, because disinformation is not a mistake, it's a lie. And when someone is lying to you, when they're telling you something that's not true, they're doing that for a reason. I mean, there's a purpose behind the lie. And so disinformation, what we usually find is that the goal is not just to get you to believe something that's false, it's to get you to distrust anybody who doesn't also believe that falsehood, which completely cuts you off from good information. And it makes you suspicious and distrustful of all the other truth tellers out there who might be giving you that information to change your mind. You don't have access to that anymore. So that's the problem. And that's, I think, that distinction explains a lot of our ills these days about science denial and what's going on with the war in Europe right now, just, a lot of them.
So just a little brief kind of perspective that I have is everything gets, especially online, is getting labeled as disinformation when some of it just might be misinformation. Peter Mccullough, for instance, is probably my best example. 667 published articles, scientific articles, but when you look him up on Wikipedia, he's labeled a misinformation spreader or disinformation spreader, saying he's purposely spreading misinformation or disinformation. And I was like, if he's published 667 times, why, when you Google him, you would pop that up, when he was the one that was open about these types of drugs that you can use during the pandemic as well, too. Now we kind of see the science turning around in a sense. Everything was labeled that. I mean, when we talk about like a major turnaround, they're now starting to do trials with ivermectin. They're starting to do trials with a bunch of different things that before they just labeled and would ban you off the internet for even suggesting. I think with science, the best part about it is that you're constantly learning. There's constantly something new out there. There's plenty of hypotheses, methods, any type of theories out there that end up like, oh, well, we're not going to throw it all the way out, but it seems like they throw it or put it in pseudoscience or fringe science. In my opinion, it's just something that we might not have all the information on.
Well, you raise an important point, which is that scientists have to be open-minded. Scientists have to be willing to, test hypotheses and see where the evidence lies. The particular person that you name there, I don't know him. I don't know his work, but the problem is this. You need the evidence. It can't just be speculation. And, if somebody is coming to a scientific question in good faith and saying, look, I've got some questions based on this evidence, and then, they've got a scientific attitude about it, they're willing to change their mind based on new evidence, then that's fine. The problem is well, really two things. One is when people are making their decisions based on ideology, so they're closed-minded. Okay, but the other problem is propaganda. So, the concern that I have, we'll just go straight at it. You raised the problem with ivermectin, right? Ivermectin is a wonder drug for what it does. Okay, so if you have, and I forget what the original application was. It was something about I think it was an antiparasitic. And so, if it's used for the appropriate purpose, it's fine. Now, I don't know where the hypothesis came from that said that was a good treatment for COVID. But the problem is that one thing that happened is that a lot of the original information was not vetted. It was not good information. It was some propaganda. Some people jumped on that bandwagon without even understanding the evidence, without really having a scientific attitude about it. And that's the problem. So I don't think it's that the question hasn't been scientifically investigated, because it actually has. It's that the problem is when people are not willing to give up their hypothesis when the evidence doesn't go their way. As somebody who's a philosopher of science, that's what really irritates me, right? That's why I talk about science deniers, because science deniers are people who are not, it's not just that they go against the scientific consensus, it's that they're not willing to change their mind when the evidence doesn't go their way.
Yeah, because it also works in the opposite way as well too. CNN calling it horse dewormer, or calling it horse paste, or something like that, and then nobody wanting to look into it because now it's been labeled, and especially if you have a media
Well,
network, you're
it is
brainwashing.
used as yes, but
Yeah,
I mean they
and
have
it's
to be
also,
careful of the language, but it is actually used as a horse dewormer, right?
but it's
But
also
they
used in India to cure river blindness in 2005, won the
right,
Nobel Prize over it as well too. Not
yeah.
to,
So
I don't want to harp on the whole ivermectin thing. I think we're both in the same boat on the same concept of science. You have to be open-minded to it, but at the same time, there's people that want to dismiss it. It's very hard to change somebody's mind, especially conspiracy theorists. I've been labeled a conspiracy theorist for just saying that I honestly don't think that the government has your best interest at heart. I feel like there's a lot of information they feel like they don't want you to know, so they choose not to release information, JFK documents, whether it's dealings with something else corporate that you just don't have the right to know. It's not their right to give it to us either. I'm just an open kind of information type person. I rather see the information, good or bad, whatever it is. I just want to know the facts of it as well too. But evidence, when we talk about evidence, whenever something gets brought to you, they never bring the other bad side to it, or they neglect a certain point to it. And during this pandemic, we saw a lot of just focusing on one certain direction rather than looking at all aspects, whether it is never been used for that ever. I feel like you should
give me
still
an
research
example.
into it.
Well, but here's the problem, right? People can't just kick in the door of science and say, and demand that any hypothesis they have be investigated. They've got to have some preliminary evidence suggesting that it's worthwhile. And the reason is because otherwise we're all down the rabbit hole, right? Science can, this I think is a fundamental misunderstanding that folks have about science. Science is not in the business of proof. Science is in the business of assessing something called warrant, right? Warrant for belief, likelihood or probability given the evidence. So, if folks come at scientists saying, well, you haven't really investigated my hypothesis thoroughly. It could be true. It's possible that it's true. You can't prove that it's not true. That's not a compelling argument for a scientist, right? I wrote an earlier book called The Scientific Attitude, where I basically, which it sounds like you had come across. And it basically, the idea behind it is this: science is defined, I think, not by its method, but by its attitude, by the mindset of people when they're assessing a scientific theory. They have to be open to, they have to care about evidence and be open to new evidence changing their mind. Now, the important thing to understand is that saying that new evidence can change your mind means that you're beholden to the world, not to what you hope is true or what other people say is true, but to what's actually true. So the thing that I love about science is that scientists are willing to say, I thought this was true, or I wanted it to be true, but we did the tests, we ran the experiments, and it turned out not to be true. And science doesn't have an unlimited number of resources. So they're not really capable of, investigating every possible hypothesis, no matter where it comes from. People can complain, that means it's a closed shop. It means they're not investigating this and that. But I think what you find, and I go into this a little bit in my book, is that scientists are actually pretty open-minded. It takes them a while sometimes, but because they're committed to the evidence, it means that, ultimately they will figure it out.
I think the term science has been hijacked, especially with people having issues with trust the science. It's not science that they have a problem with; it's the way that people use it, and they kind of discount other things as well too. I wish there was a more open conversational platform, whether it comes to the debates or whether it comes, because everything just seems like entertainment. It seems like you're just having two people fight and no logical, I guess, progress is really happening. And I feel like if you just, like, even with conspiracy people, if you just talk to them and understand, like, yeah, there's a line where you gotta be like, well, why do you think that? It's just an open conversational platform. I feel like you would
I,
get a lot more
I do,
progress out of
I
it.
do that. I have those
I'm not saying you don't. I
conversations.
was just
Yeah,
saying, yeah.
no, no, I agree with you, because people people who believe in conspiracy theories tend not to just believe in one, they believe in many. And that suggests that it's not simply what the basis is for the evidence, on whatever the particular conspiracy theory is. And so, I've had these conversations in which my goal is not to talk about the specific content, but to ask, why do you believe that? And more importantly, what evidence could convince you that you were wrong? Because I think these kind of conversations are really important. I went to a flat Earth convention specifically to have these conversations.
How fun was
You
that?
know? Well, it was exciting, but a little weird
Did they
as
bring up
well.
Hitler? They always bring up Hitler. They always bring up him.
I did not have anybody bring that up, but the point is, they were conspiracy theorists, and I wanted, as all science deniers are, and I wanted to know why not just what they believed, because they were ready for that question. They could talk about that question all day, all night. Anything I brought up, from ancient astronomy to Newton to anything, they had talking points on this. What they did, what they were not used to talking about with a philosopher, was why do they believe what they believe. So for me, it was really stimulating conversation, and I hope for them too. And I was respectful and patient and calm and kind about the conversations, even though I was very upfront. I think they're wrong. And so these kind of conversations are important. But the thing is, they're not scientific conversations. What the flat earthers are doing is not science. And the reason it's not, even though they would say, that scientists are closed-minded, or, they don't have an objection against science. Science is just done in the wrong way. They consider themselves to be scientists. I don't consider what they do to be science, because they cannot tell me in advance what evidence, what experiment would change their mind. And I asked them. I took one guy out to dinner for 2 hours. I mean, we mixed it up, and I never got a straight answer to what would change their mind. Scientists can answer that. Deniers cannot.
The way I kind of rationalize a flat earther is that NASA, I guess they added clouds, or they touched up a photo of the first, like, global, like the circular shot where you can see the whole pano view of it, and they added
Yeah.
clouds to make it look more beautiful, I guess, to the public, and they admitted to doing so as well too. And that's
Mhm.
where it's like, if you admit, or you say that you did lie, then what's to trust you again? And that's kind of where I can rationalize it. I don't believe the earth is flat at all. I have a
Yeah.
friend who does. Even though I've had astrophysicists, even the questions he's asked me, I've had
Right.
astrophysicists on, tell him no, it's not. I look at it more from like a Younger Dryas theory perspective, the hypothesis of an extinction event. Now there's people that have dismissed it and wouldn't even look into it. And it's taken 15, 20 years where now those same scientists have actually came out in interviews talking about we might have dismissed it a little bit too early. I look at that part of it where I think you need to have a more of an, not, I wouldn't just say open mind. I think just more of a conversation or a thorough look through. If someone, I get it, there's too many hypotheses out there, there's too many theories.
Mhm.
Trust me, there's a whole list of them. Um,
Right.
but you can't go into every single one. You can't do all this. But if you start like seeing, like, I feel like if you can, like, why I do video on the show, if you can look at someone and really
Mhm.
honestly tell if they're in 100% convinced into this thing, then it might be worth a little bit of time. And that's where I want to see is I want to see the human species excel. And it seems like in every step forward we take two steps back in a sense. I mean, innovations with science, innovations with tech, innovations all over the board, but in a lot of
Mhm.
sense, the general public is still standing in a spot of I don't know what to do. And that's a big
Yeah.
question.
I'm concerned with some of the same things that you are, but I'd frame it differently. Where it is possible for science to miss things. You can come up with examples in the past where science has, everybody was on the wrong side of it, and then one guy came forward, with plate tectonics, or Galileo, or Semmelweis, the guy who said, shouldn't we wash our hands before we operate? I mean, these people are laughed at, by the consensus of science. But the difference there is this: they had the evidence. Galileo had the evidence. Semmelweis had the evidence. Wegener had the evidence. And so ultimately, even though it can take too long, their hypothesis ended up being vindicated. The problem that I have with um, anti-vaxxers, with climate deniers, with flat earthers, is that they're always wanting me to evaluate and take seriously the little crumbs of whatever they've come up with, and not look at the loaf of bread sitting there. And sometimes the crumbs can indicate something important, and we have to take that seriously. But remember when I a couple of minutes ago I talked about the problem of warrant. Warrant is this concept in philosophy of science that there has to be some sense of proportionality, right? It's irrational to believe something unless there's sufficient evidence for you to believe it. So even if something can, turn out later to be true, it could still be irrational to believe it because you don't have enough evidence. Now, I know that's not going to convince people who say, oh, but, look at this, look at that, look at this experiment, that experiment. I get this from anti-vaxxers all the time, right? But I want to try to widen the discussion a little bit and say something to your audience that they may not be hearing other places. One of the most important things to keep in mind is that there is an industry of people who are out there disinforming you about science on purpose, trying to get you to take things seriously that really don't deserve to be taken seriously. Why would somebody do that? Sometimes it's economic interests, right? Look at what the cigarette companies did with this link between smoking and lung cancer. They've been lying since the 1950s about that because they wanted to make a profit on their tobacco products. Look at what the fossil fuel industry did with climate change. They were donating money to places that were trying to denigrate the idea that there was any such thing, that climate change was real, at the same time that their own scientists knew that it was real, and in fact were making plans to drill in the Arctic once the polar ice cap had melted. But now I want to say something that is I think important and lost in a lot of the current debate, which is that some of the lies being told that make about COVID, say, are from foreign intelligence services.
Russian troll
They're
farms.
from they are
Yeah,
They
that's
are.
crazy.
And
Yeah.
I mean, for people who take conspiracy theories seriously, I want to tell you, this is a real conspiracy. This is not something that you have to look in the shadows for. There were report in the Wall Street Journal
There was a
on
lady who
this.
came out with a video of her going into the place. They don't even keep the heat on going in, and she was wearing puffer jackets. But do you know how long
Yeah,
that was considered a conspiracy? That was labeled
yeah,
under the conspiracy thing, and no one gave it a chance until actual evidence came out.
right.
That's only going to fuel the conspiracy fire. But the reason why people get into
Yeah,
this type of stuff is also it's not just the disinformation side, because who's the disinformation side? The CDC has went back on the mask thing. Now, here's the thing where I go with this.
hmm.
That's evidence. You end up learning more. Science is going to keep evolving. But my issue becomes is when you shut down the other narrative or you say, no, this is the only one. It's kind of like if you know the Innocence Project, what they do is they get
Hmm.
wrongfully convicted people out
Yeah,
of
yeah,
prison.
I know.
The blood splatter analysis and the fire match thing, that's all BS. And they've exposed that and it's now been changed. It's not going to rule in court anymore. But for so long it did. That's the thing is like my issue is becomes the reason why these people hop on these things or people run with the first thing they see is because there's no trust. My whole thing was building
You,
trust.
you're exactly right.
That's all I
It's
want.
about, you're exactly right. The problem these days, I think, is not a lack of evidence, it's a lack of trust. Because when you don't trust the scientists, when people don't trust the CDC, when they don't trust NASA, there's a problem. Because then the question is, okay, so then where are you getting your information? And how are you sure that that information is accurate? And I was one of the early critics, actually, of the idea that of how the CDC handled the mask question, because in the early days of just when the pandemic started and nobody knew what was going on, um, I started to wonder, well, why aren't we all wearing N95 masks? N95 masks are the ones that they use at the hospitals. And if it's really that bad, why aren't we all wearing N95 masks? And then they came out with a recommendation, well, but you don't need to do that. Now, it turns out that part of the motivation for that recommendation was that they didn't want the general public
To buy up all the
snatching all the
masks. Yeah.
masks and not leaving them for the medical professionals, which is a perfectly reasonable thing. My wife is a medical professional. I understand, people who deal with COVID 24/7 have higher risk than the people who are just, on the street. So they wanted to, it's like giving the bullets to the soldiers, right? We have to ration it. But they didn't say that. And I think that that destroyed some trust. Because then when, as you're right, the science does change, right? They learn different things over time. Then it became very hard for people to trust the later recommendations because they say, well, but didn't you lie to us before? Now, I don't know whether it was a lie or not, but it was not, a completely straightforward rationale for why we shouldn't all be using N95 masks. And my take on it was N95 masks won't hurt. It's not a bad thing for you. Maybe maybe a cloth mask is just as good for ordinary exposure. Turns out it's not. Okay. But wouldn't it be just as good for ordinary exposure? But would it harm you to wear an N95? I asked my wife, she said, no, it wouldn't harm you to wear an N95. But, we're having real problems with those. We don't have enough to go around at the hospital. They give me one a week, that was the issue at the time.
Which
So I
I
understand
could,
completely what you're saying
yeah.
about the destruction of trust. That can be a real problem.
Which I can understand with them saying that because, yeah, you want your healthcare workers to get them because sadly, everyone, whenever it comes to a pandemic or comes to some type of, I mean, even the red meat scare, if you look that up, that's now under like the conspiracy thing as well, too. People, when the stimulus checks came out, they flocked to the stores and got red meat thinking that all red meat was going to go out. I guess this was like the start of the pandemic or I
Yeah.
guess the first couple of months in it.
Red meat and toilet paper, right? That's what
Yeah.
they were. empty shelves at my
Yeah.
local supermarket, red meat and toilet paper.
People hoard everything when it comes to a storm. So I get their point behind it, but I think you just need to let people know, like, hey, we gotta, and it's going to be hard to talk down some of the public's not going to want to listen. Other people just they don't have that trust there. But I feel like with the general
Yeah,
public, when you're open like that, it leaves the door open for, like, we're not telling you that they don't work, or we're not telling you that not to
that's
buy.
right.
It's just more of a
It,
open
it
conversational thing.
and in the long run, it might have saved more lives too.
Yeah.
Is the thing that I occurred to me. I mean, my parents who have now both passed were my dad fought in World War II, and my mom was a war worker at home. And there were enormous shortages on rubber and metal and nylon and different sorts of things that they just couldn't get because they were going for the overseas war effort. And people pitched in, they understood. I mean, the phrase that they used back then, which I still heard my dad use up until old age. Don't you know there's a war on, right?
Yeah.
You can't waste because it belongs somewhere else. And I think that message would have been a smarter message. So people distrust somebody who's a know-it-all. They distrust people who say, I'm the expert, you need to listen to me. Even if they are an expert and you do need to listen to them, they can't put it that way. So one thing that I've been a great advocate for is that scientists need to, even though I'm very, very pro-science,
I am too.
I'm a great advocate of the idea that scientists need to learn how to better communicate with people who disagree with them and people who don't trust them. Because without trust, nobody cares about your PhD. They don't, because they don't believe what you're saying. And right now, there are think tanks, there are organizations affiliated with universities that are doing, I think, a very good job of trying to educate both journalists and scientists and others who care about science to do a better job with that. Because I'll give you an example here, if you can stand it. One of my favorite, and this is an anecdotal account from the newspaper, but you can look it up. There was a measles outbreak in Vancouver, Washington in 2014. And Vancouver had a very high preponderance of people who were anti-vaxxers. And so that's where the measles outbreak happened. Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State sent public health officials down with the idea that they needed to talk to the people one-on-one. They didn't need to come down and say, I'm a scientist, back off, I'm a scientist, you need to listen to me. But to really get in and have these patient, respectful, listening conversations, which they did, and it worked. And if you read the article about this, it was in the Washington Post years back, but the article is called, if you just Google the phrase, "it will take off like wildfire," Washington Post, it'll come up in Google. It'll be your first hit. It used to be anyway. This worked. And people who previously were not giving their kids the measles vaccine said, that scientist was so warm and so patient. And he spent 2 hours with a whiteboard explaining cell interaction. And I felt respected. And now I'm going to have my kid vaccinated. I think that is the model for the kind of conversation that needs to happen, right? It doesn't mean that, I think sometimes scientists feel threatened when their expertise is challenged. And there's no need for that. It's, remember that some science deniers are being victimized by disinformation and need to be patient and try to build up the trust that has been destroyed. That doesn't mean, I have to say, that, every fringe hypothesis has to be investigated, by every scientist. But it does mean that if we're trying to convince somebody to take a controversial recommendation seriously, or something that they don't want to hear, we have to be patient and try to build that trust back, because trust is, once it's destroyed, it's very hard to build it back.
Well, it's the same thing you're doing with me right now. I mean, I'm 24, and you're talking to me like I'm actually at the same level as you. Mostly, and I know the start of it kind of seemed like I was going to go into this propaganda like conspiracy spiral. I'm not that type at all. I think you're starting to see like I'm literally like I think just people hijack the term science. I think even with fact checker, everything was coming out fact check this,
Yeah.
fact check that, and then now they found out after Zuckerberg, Facebook fact checker, they're just opinion people. I mean, there was a Facebook whistleblower that came out of
Yeah.
nowhere. Where did she go? Where did the whole Gabby Petito case was months and months focused on that. Now we don't hear a word of it. And then 2 months later pops up, they find Brian Lauder's autopsy comes back. It's like, where did this person come from? I don't know. And you have a bunch of people questioning, like, what the hell's going on? Are they trying to distract us from the main point? The whole thing.
I don't know anything about the topic that you just raised, but
She's
I
apparently a
but
top influencer that
I
just came out of nowhere.
I compare it to Zuckerberg saying that it was crazy to think that that Facebook had any role in amplifying disinformation that influenced the election. But then a year or two later, they admit that something like 150 million people, so I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it was a lot. I think it was 150 million or close, saw some of the foreign created disinformation, some of those memes that we all saw about the election. And how do they know whether it influenced the vote? They don't. But as a corporation, they're worried about their bottom line. He didn't want to admit it. Yeah, corporations lie,
Well, Twitter did the
for their
same
own
thing
interest.
with Biden laptop. That happened at the state next to me in Delaware. They found Hunter Biden's laptop and it had a bunch of like meeting messages with like just horrible, incriminating pictures. He was on crack for a short, brief amount of time, I think. But you couldn't find that on Twitter. It was trending, trying to, but then they kept blocking it and they kept banning it and they kept rising up
Why do you
hashtags.
think? Why do you think though?
Probably because it's a left platform. It's definitely got the narrative was that. Now you're going to see everything come across like after Let's Go Brandon. I think everyone's like gas is $4. Everybody's complaining about now. So I think
Mhm.
Biden's now not the one that they were trying to cover up. They just didn't want Trump to be elected. I'm sure in that case. I don't
Well,
think I wanted him up there either.
in some, you and I are watching some. You've seen some information that I haven't seen that
I'm just
I'm
on
not
Twitter
able to
seeing it
content
trend.
to comment on, but um, there is a problem. I mean, you're raising an important problem, which is that um, something can polarization happens not only on the right but on the left, and polarization can mean that sometimes there's true information that's not taken seriously. I'll give you an example. Remember the hypothesis about where COVID came from? And at first they were saying,
Conspiracy.
obviously it came from the wet markets in Wuhan.
Now they're looking at
And
the
then
lab
and then
though.
somebody came and said, yeah, but what about that lab? And then it looked like there was a little more evidence than they had thought, and the people who had dismissed it were a little hasty. But then I read the other day in the New York Times that they had now done 2 experiments that were definitive, or all, they can't be completely definitive, right? Because can't prove it, but that it gave overwhelming evidence that it was from the wet market. But see, the point is that was a hypothesis that even if it turned out to be false about it coming from the Wuhan lab, needed to be taken more seriously.
Yeah.
And I think that one thing, and I think you're absolutely right, that one thing that happens is people say, oh, you know what? That was a right-wing hypothesis. Therefore, it must be fake. Therefore, we can't even bother to investigate it. So it's a blinder, right? Polarization is a blinder because it substitutes ideology for good judgment. But I'm not trying to draw a false equivalence here, because I think that that's an easy thing to do. But what I am saying is that it is possible for information to be overlooked, even by people who are fact checkers, because they say, oh, well, that came from an unreliable source, or, look at all the unreliable people who believe that, so I'm not going to take it seriously. I'm a great believer that science should have nothing to do with ideology, whether that ideology is from the right or the left, whether it's religious or political. The reason I'm so in favor of science is because science is the way it's supposed to work, the way it usually works, is that the evidence is the thing that decides it. And yes, there are many examples in history when that wasn't the case, and there is such a thing as scientific fraud. But the thing that I respect about science is that scientists are so picky and so competitive that they are always checking one another's work to see, is this right? Is this experiment able to be replicated? Where did that person's funding come from? They're always asking those skeptical questions. And boy, that's the way to do it. When I go, to my doctor and I want to trust her about, what I've been exposed to and how I should treat it, I want to know that the information she's sharing with me has been through that mill.
I was the one from the beginning saying it probably came from the lab. And if you Google Wuhan now, I don't know when the last time you Googled Wuhan was, is that they're not, I think that it gets lumped in the argument that they were doing back coronavirus research, which I just honestly think that they had coronavirus stuff in bottles there or tubes
It
there.
sounds like, wasn't it Jon Stewart, that left-wing guy, Jon Stewart, who said, I'm sorry, it was the Wuhan,
And they called him a
corona.
right-wing conspiracy note
Right.
afterwards.
So, the idea that look, sometimes there are wacky hypotheses that aren't so wacky and they deserve to be taken seriously. When ideology is behind the hypothesis, I think that's a bad thing. But when ideology tells us, oh, don't take that hypothesis seriously because look who's saying it, that's also a bad thing. It should be assessed on the merits.
Well, yeah.
It does, it can make people suspicious. And like I said, there's not an infinite number of resources. But the thing I love about science is that it's supposed to be anti-ideological.
Well, that's to my bigger point with the Wuhan thing, is that people called you racist for even saying or suggesting it came from there. And now that term is getting thrown around like crazy. If you're on Twitter or any social media site, people just label people a racist, or they call them a right-wing conspiracy nut person. That's the same term when those same people are using the term science onto something that is not, it's not even science based. There's no science behind it in a sense. People are taking terms just like fact checker was taken, and they're saying, trust the science. It's like, well, what science are, you're not showing evidence in a sense. I'm not saying with the basic like COVID rules. I'm just saying with the grand scale, people are taking terms now and it's becoming numb. It's becoming a word that doesn't mean anything. I feel like racism doesn't mean the same as it did 100 years ago or 50 years ago or even 5 years ago.
Not my area, but people, when trust is broken, when people look, I'll say this: when people feel alienated, they begin, say from science or from medical professionals, they begin to, and you feel that first seed in your head to say, maybe they're lying to me. Not maybe they're wrong, maybe they're lying to me.
When are they going to break my heart again?
Then you, okay, then you go out, what do? You go to the internet. And the internet is polluted with false information. And people start with the internet, say with YouTube. And the problem with YouTube is the way the algorithms work. I'll come back to flat earth. You watch one flat earth video, guess what you get 20 more of right in a row. And then when you watch 20 flat earth videos in a row, you think, well, damn, maybe they've got something there. Do I really understand? How do I know? Then you go to a convention. That's where you become radicalized, right? So by the time I got to the convention, there were 650 people there who were completely radicalized by, this was the end of their journey, not the beginning for most of them, right? They were with other like-minded people. It was going to be impossible for me to convince them that they were wrong. My goal was to get them to listen. to see if I could get them to listen to me by listening to them, to see if I could overcome some of that distrust. I think that's where it starts. There's a model that science has used for a long time that I don't think it works. It's called the information deficit model. That you just share people true information and they believe it. You know, if somebody's mistaken, give them the truth, they'll believe it. It doesn't work anymore. And it doesn't work because people don't trust the information because they don't trust the person who's giving it to them. So what we're doing now, what I do all the time, what I've kind of discovered works, is to have conversations with people. That's when trust is built. That's when people really learn that we have more in common than we thought. And when trust is destroyed, it's when we're alienated from each other. We're in the comment section of a political article and we're pissed off. And, that's when people are rude. That's when people hate.
Well, social media hasn't made it better either. That
No, it has
disconnect.
not.
That's why I
It
do
has
video
not.
on the show. Like I said, you need to have this
Yeah.
realization that I'm not like, if it was just a picture on screen, not me moving around and talking like how I am, you wouldn't know what I was doing in the background. If I was doing something nefarious or if I was sitting there laughing at everything you're saying. No, you need to see like I'm generally interested in the
Yeah.
conversation. And that sense of connection is what is missing from social media, where you're seeing a lot of this go out there. And sadly, anybody can put up a graph or an article. I've had people that'll tell you climate change isn't real and people that'll tell you climate change is real. Actual climatologists talk about it. I mean, talking to them, they both have good evidence, but I think it's also about hearing them out in a sense as well too, which I mean, it's not going to be everybody's job, and nobody's job should be to listen to every single person. You're not going to like every single person. You don't need to listen to every single person. But I
Well,
think it's just about showing that you're not devaluing their principle as their thought. Like you can easily do that with conspiracy theorists. And I get it.
yeah.
Some are, like I said, the flat earth one goes down an Adolf Hitler rabbit hole that I'm surprised you didn't
I
come into.
they didn't talk about that,
It's
but
linked with the
the
Rothschild, but
the the okay.
I was just going to say my bigger point is that I feel like when you start, the reason why people link to these types of things is because they already feel isolated as it is, and they're
Yes.
looking for a small group to get into. And everything nowadays, whether it's social media showing it the best, it's all group mindsets. It's all tribal thinking in a sense, and that group.
There's a social aspect to all
Yeah,
belief.
yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's something you said there though that I want to take issue with, which is that I think there's a difference between respecting the person and respecting the content of what they're saying, because sometimes it's wrong.
Until that
And so,
idea is their whole person, though, then what do you do then?
but you raise a great point, right? Because sometimes the belief is not just what they believe, it's who they are. So when you attack the belief, you're attacking them as a person, right? So you just said a second ago that there was good evidence on both sides of the climate debate. And I would say there's not. There's some, there are some people who have legitimate scientific credentials who are pushing back against the idea that climate change is real, but they do not have evidence that is convincing. They haven't convinced their colleagues. And I mean, this happens all the time in science right now. Look, how do scientists decide what's true and what's false? They look at the evidence. If the field moves on, that doesn't mean that they need to be disrespectful of the other people or to call them pseudoscientists or to claim that they're deniers, that they're not doing important work. Some of them are their scientific colleagues. So I deplore the kind of name calling, canceling, dismissing thing, unless it's fraud. Okay, if it's fraud,
Yeah,
they're out of the profession. But it is always important to respect somebody as a person, because, and I mean, for me, this came home because you bring up the identity question. What I realize is that some people are hurt. They have experienced trauma. That's why they don't trust. That's why, they're willing to go down that flat earth rabbit hole, because they feel like they've been lied to on other things. And so then the question blooms, well, what else have they lied to me about? Every flat earther I talked to had a conversion experience. I would say, how did you get into flat earth? And they could all tell me exactly the day, the moment that they did it. And it was because they had something happen in their life. For a lot of them, it was 9/11, where they started to feel like they were being lied to. And that led to the larger question of what else are they lying to me about? So, like I said, if you believe one conspiracy theory, research has shown, you're more likely to believe others. People at Flat Earth would say, what are your top 20 conspiracy theories? I mean, and not as a joke. I mean, that was their opening. A couple of people, when they met one another, they would say, well, what other conspiracy theories do you believe? It was chemtrails, it was all this other stuff, the wildfires in California started by the government, all of this other stuff. Again, it's a mindset. It's a way of thinking. And my goal was to challenge the mindset, not to challenge them as a person. But you raise a good point. How do you do that? I think you do it by being calm and respectful, by understanding that we're all human beings and we all deserve respect.
I agree with you 100%. I think that's what I try and do, at least my best. I do entertain some conspiracies just to open up that door to have an actual discussion about it, because a lot of people will sit there and be like, no, I'm not even going to talk about it because you're not going to believe me anyway. And then they're like, well, that's not how the
Yeah.
game's played. We got to chat about it and see where it goes from there. Um, it's not my place to tell someone that they're wrong, and it's am I right? How will I know? Maybe new evidence will come out later. I have no clue. I'm not saying that the earth isn't flat. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that the earth is flat, but you
Hmm.
get, because everyone knows the earth's 8,000
What
years
if
old.
your life depended? What if your life depended on that,
What, gun
though?
to my head?
No, I don't mean that. I'm talking about COVID. I'm talking about climate change. I'm talking about, what if the stakes of believing the wrong thing are life-threatening? I'll give you another example here. I know someone in my life, someone I care about, who had cancer. And she had a relative who was very alternative healing oriented. Don't trust the doctors, don't trust,
Energy healing.
medicine. Yeah, it was all alternative medicine. But the minute her daughter got cancer, she took her straight to the oncologist, because it was no screwing around, right? It wasn't, I'm going to engage you in whatever alternative cures and we're going to see, because I don't trust Western medicine. It was, I'm taking you straight to the oncologist. So my question is, what do you do when your life depends on it? Because the flat earthers are not hurting anybody.
Well,
Um,
how many
but
people
the
on the
COVID deniers and the climate deniers, there are lives at stake for that kind of denial, don't you think?
Yeah, but even if lives are at stake and you're talking about mandates and you're just forcing one thing, don't you think that there should be all options and avenues when searching for something that might be
Yeah.
beneficial and helping you deal with it? And I think that's their point with
Well,
ivermectin. Or why did my governor ban hydroclonal antibodies? Why did that happen when there's been
yeah.
plenty of evidence that's shown there are some states that swear by it? I have no clue, but it's like a case per case basis. I mean, there it's kind of like dealing in the realm of hypotheticals. If that's might possibly be true, but are we going to waste resources on it for an individual person, or are we going to focus on the mass public? I mean, everybody they got points on it as well too, but
Yeah.
the same person that decides to use energy healing to heal their loved one is gonna, if their daughter gets cancer or something like that, might that one person might just be like, I'm going to do as much energy healing as possible and still not trust Western medicine. Like I said, it's a case per case basis. That's why when you talk to people and you learn, not every individual
Yeah.
person is not the same. So not every individual template's not the same. My issue starts to become where I can stand with the mistrust issues is that you
Hmm.
should be looking at everything during this
Y-
pandemic to find a way through, but not one president or anybody like that has
Yeah.
talked about getting healthy or losing weight. And the fear behind that is losing votes. Nobody wants to be told that you might be too fat and you got to lose weight. I'm in the fitness industry as it is. I work at a gym. The whole thing is about getting in shape and getting fit. A lot of people don't want to hear that. A lot of people don't want to say you put on a couple of pounds. A lot of people don't want to say that you're, it's fat shaming. I mean, in a sense, there
Right,
was
right,
there's a comedian on Joe Rogan who he was trying to tell his son that he needs to lose weight because he's like, during the pandemic had gained like at least I think 20 something pounds. And he was telling him like, I want you to lose weight because I care about you. And they say comorbidities and obesity is one of them.
right,
People were giving that dad crap about what him telling his kid he needs to lose some weight in a respectful way, in a sense. There are other people that just be like, you're
right,
fat and then Sharpie pig on
right,
their
right,
forehead,
right.
but they don't do that. But that's the thing is, are you telling me the truth? Are you just telling me what I want to hear? And I don't want to hear what I want to hear. I want to hear what the evidence is. I want to see that. But a lot of people in positions of power, why does gas drop from $4 to two whatever during when it's reelection or when it's that midterms type thing? Because they don't want to lose what they got, but then they'll jack it back up when there's no fear of them being pushed out. That's the trust issue. You want to build
Yes.
trust.
Yeah.
Stop telling us what we want to hear. Start doing things with evidence behind it. In a lot of sense, this whole pandemic has been like, I'm going to pick and choose what I want to do. And it's like, you can't do that. You have to come to hands with $1 million. If I'm going to offer that to you, you have to bring the pile of shit in the other. I don't want to see a surprise of that. I want to see them both at the table. And that's all my whole thing is, coming to the table 100% clean. You need to do that. I'm not thinking about anything. I'm just talking to you. I'm feeling this. I'm in this, whatever this
Mm.
is. That's coming to the table 100% clean. You can be worried about what's going to, whatever, down the road. You can't. You have to focus on what's in front of you. And that's what this whole pandemic should be. I get planning and avoiding a future outbreak or whatever if we're going to stay on the pandemic topic. But when it comes to just, you can't cherry pick what you feel is good and bad. You can't do that with the unreleased documents of JFK. You can't do that with the unreleased documents of 9/11 that they're still holding. If it's bad or whatever the hell government wise, it's incorporated into it. When it's lives, when it's anything, people just want to feel like you're valuing them as an individual. And sadly, there's just been I mean, you're seeing a lot of I wouldn't say more libertarians, but more definitely anarchy, in a sense of people wanting to defund the police just because of a concept of they don't like people feeling like they have more power over them. Nobody's like that.
People, you and I agree that trust is a fundamental issue. I think, though, that one thing that I want to make sure that that I make clear is to respect somebody as a person doesn't mean that you have to take seriously. Look, what should the medical industry allow somebody? Should they participate in allowing somebody to engage in a treatment that either they know isn't going to help them or might hurt them? You know, is that really, is that honest? Is that respect for them as a person? Say you're a physician and you've got a patient and they're sick and there's a treatment for this, but they say, oh, no, I don't trust the pharmaceutical company that came up for that. I want to use, this other, folk healing thing that, I believe in. What's your ethical responsibility as a physician then? I presume wouldn't want to say, well, they might, look, you don't want to say, well, they might be right, because the evidence doesn't show that they're right. But it's not just a question of evidence, it's a question of respect for them as a person. And it becomes much more difficult when it's not just, will that your decision about treatment affect them, but will it affect other people, right? Or suppose the person that you're dealing with, I'm sorry, philosophers do this all the time, these crazy examples, but suppose the person's a minor, right? And you're letting the parents make a decision for the minor child that's, you as a medical professional know is wrong. It's going to hurt that minor child, but the parent says, no, respect my autonomy to make this decision that, with every fiber in your being, it's going to turn out to be wrong. It is, I mean, you got to have the wisdom of Solomon to figure that one out.
What
How to respect somebody's right to say, I don't want a blood transfusion. I'm going to come to the hospital and you can treat me, I'm going to go into surgery, but don't you dare give me a blood transfusion because it's against my religious belief. That has to be respected. It affects that one individual. The policy at most hospitals is they'll respect that. But if somebody comes to the hospital and says, my child has cancer, but I don't believe in chemotherapy, I want you to treat them with, these alternative healing, and you're the one who has to administer it. Is it really the responsibility of the hospital, the physician, to do it just in the interest of respect, knowing that the evidence doesn't support it and they're harming someone else? I'm in favor of individual freedom.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in favor of, people being able to make their own decisions. But in a pandemic with climate change, it doesn't just affect the individual, it affects all of us.
But if it affects a life, what happens if I just change the hypothetical to a
Yeah.
child wanting to get a surgery to change his gender? If there's evidence, and there's on both sides as
Yeah.
well too, what's the ethical thing? That's the thing, is what is the word ethical? I don't trust peer reviewed for shit. Not because it might, even if it agrees with me, I just don't know who those peers are. I haven't talked to those people. I don't know where they could be swayed in. And
Well,
sadly, it's
wait
money
a
and
minute.
society.
Wait a minute, though. Peer review is an important principle behind science,
I
where
believe it is.
who those peers are. Those peers are your scientific colleagues who
Okay.
believe the same thing that you do, which
Well,
is that you've got to have the evidence, that your theory has to be tested, that if you make a prediction and the prediction ends up being false, then there's something wrong with your theory, right?
yeah, but
So,
doesn't
I
peer
mean,
reviewed become an issue when they have after Joe Rogan had Peter McCullough on, and they have 200, they make an article saying 260 doctors talking about that it's misinformation, or no, it was Robert Malone saying that he wasn't the person that was leading the charge with mRNA vaccines, and then also talking about ivermectin. And you look into those 260 doctors that they talked about signing a thing saying that this is wrong and false. They're dentists, they're people that authors, there are people that have a
mm,
doctor in their name, but they're not
yeah,
medically advised to be
like
speaking
me.
on these things.
Yeah, they're
Well,
not a medical
I'm
doctor.
not insulting
No,
you at
no,
all.
no,
Trust
no.
me,
I
it's not it.
understand that. I'm just
I'm
saying I'm
saying
not.
with the whole thing is, though, where's the ethical line drawn? If you have peer reviewed people, most of the time they're reaching out to peers that are friends of those people. Now, Peter Boghossian, I don't know if you know who he is.
I do. He's a philosopher.
This study, misconceptual penis study, where he wrote an article for a university to publish that was
Mhm.
just littered with just things that immediately Manchurian candidate any institution to not go against society and make sure that they publish the article, saying that literally there was a part in it where saying if you sit with your legs spread open, it's akin to raping the air around you, and somehow your dick was linked to climate change.
He wrote this.
He wrote this, yes. It
Yeah.
was him and two other people, I think. I was
Right.
talking to one of his friends on my show. I think it was, I don't know if it was Peter. But that, what is that? I mean, he wrote it. There was a study that was brought up by Brett Weinstein on Joe Rogan podcast about Peter's study about a person going to a dog park and every day spending a total of like, I think it was 2.5 years.
That one I heard about. Yeah,
Okay,
the
so
dog park study.
where does
Yeah.
the thing get drawn where we talk about, if we're talking about a person for religious beliefs, is it the ethical thing to let that doctor go? I mean, in their case
Well,
scenario, they'd want to treat them, but you can't just dismiss it because you might not. I'm not religious, but even if it's a religion thing,
yeah.
what about the trans thing? Nobody ever goes against that. Nobody ever goes against the money issue.
I think that the thing to keep in mind here is that which on the topic of peer review and how do studies go forward when there's nothing to them? How is a bogus study accepted? That sort of thing. Who did they get to review it? And as I understand, at least one of Boghossian's studies wasn't reviewed. They didn't even undergo peer review, but I may be mistaken about that, but I don't think it was, which is, shame on the journal for doing that, right? They're supposed to peer review the work, even if it's not scientific work. I'm a philosopher. My work has to be peer reviewed. That's just, you expect that.
They're interesting studies.
But but made up, right?
Yeah, that's the smart part behind it.
But the interesting, and this was done before, this was done 30 years ago. There was some folks who did this as well. The idea, if there's a problem with peer review, I don't think the solution is to get rid of it. I think the solution is to mend it, right? So I'll give you an example. So I'm a journal editor. I'm a deputy editor of a journal. And one of the most important principles that we use in assigning a peer reviewer to an article. So an article comes in and we think, okay, this is interesting. Maybe we want to publish it. Maybe we don't. It's outside my area of expertise, but even if it's in my area of expertise, I need somebody else to look at it. We try to find somebody who isn't in the same department as the person, doesn't know the person, wasn't their mentor in graduate school or something, right? Somebody who's going to be more objective, right? So it's on me to do this. And then the other principle, the one that I respect the most, is when it's something called a double-blind reviewing, right? Where in peer review, the person who wrote the article doesn't know who reviewed it, but very importantly, the person reviewing it doesn't know who wrote it. Because sometimes, say you're a famous person sending in a paper, the person reviewing it will think, oh, well, look who that famous person is. That study has to be good. And so maybe they're not as hard on it. So there are these mechanisms. And I wrote a little bit about this in my book, Scientific Attitude. I had a chapter on fraud, and I had a chapter on things that are right up to the line, but not quite fraud. And there are, you can come up with examples where, science is not perfect, but the answer is to, come up with mechanisms like the one that I just, told you, which a lot of journals use about double-blind peer review, which allows, more objectivity. It's not a perfect system, but it's better than not having it.
Yeah.
There's another virulent problem right now in the scientific literature, the replication crisis. There are certain studies that cannot be reproduced, but most studies, nobody even tries to reproduce them.
Yeah. Well, I'm not.
So I mean, there are all these, there are all these statistical ways that I won't bore you with, but there are all these statistical ways, and I go into it in my book, where people kind of fudge a little bit, and science is responsive to that. And so I'll say, that's why I do trust science, because scientists, even though they're not perfect, they are on the job to try to figure out where their imperfections are and how to deal with it. And that's something that I think is important, because without that, I would just feel lost. I mean, where would I get my information? How would I know who to trust? It would be awful.
Do you see the point I'm trying to make, though? I'm not for advocating for no peer review at all. I just look at it like people toss the word peer review it out like it's an Oreo flavor. Like everyone, they could do one like every week, but they're tossing it out like it's nothing. Like what do you mean peer reviewed? Can I see it? Can I link the people to those people? Or are you getting people that are you just having a group of yes men? That's the whole thing.
Yeah, no,
nobody
you're
ever brings
right.
in that no.
And the thing I like about your way of thinking is that you're skeptical and you're also open-minded. And if you read Carl Sagan, that's the recipe for being a scientist. You want to be, and that's a delicate balance, isn't it? Because you've got to be open-minded enough that new hypotheses make their way in to challenge you so that you don't just believe what you want to believe. But you've also got to be skeptical enough that you're not just believing every single thing that somebody tells you. Carl Sagan, great, I mean, he's not known as a humorist, but he said something in his book that was very funny. He said, you want to be open-minded, but not so open that your brains fall out, right? So, you've got to have this, you probably heard that before. You got to be skeptical enough to, to challenge the information. And that's the real balance in science, right? To be open-minded enough that new evidence can change your mind, but skeptical that until it's tested by this rigorous process involving peer review, you're not going to let it through to change this, well-warranted belief that you already have. And if you've never, I mean, look, you probably read Sagan before, but if you haven't, his book that I love, I mean, most people know him as a popular astronomer, but he's got this book called The Demon Haunted World. where I mean, it's a readable book. It's a trade book. Even somebody like me who's not an astronomer, I can read it. And it's fascinating because he talks about not only science, but the mindset that you need to do science. And I think that one thing, you and I are probably disagree on some things, but I think that one thing that we agree on is this idea that respect matters and that evidence matters and that how you approach other people who disagree with you matter. I'm very impressed at what you're doing now, having a show where you're talking to all these people, some of whom you're going to disagree with, who are challenging you and you're challenging them. I think that's the right way to do it. I have various things that I want to send you and say, read this, read that. It'll maybe give you ideas for other people you could have on your show.
Yeah.
But that's something for an email later on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than willing to have you back on the show too. I actually really appreciate you giving me your time as well too. I want to give you a chance
Sure.
to promote your books and everything too, but I really want to say, like, it's very easy to dismiss someone who's, even if it's just me, I'm 20 something. I'm not saying you're old or anything. I'm just saying it's
No,
easy
you're
to
same
just,
age as my son.
well,
I'm
it's
used to being challenged by 20 somethings because I got a son.
but it's very easy in life to do that. And I think it's not really maybe a sense of paranoia in a sense is good in some sense, but it's interesting. Like the conspiracy people, I'm with it to a point to where it gets violent. And then I say, that's where it's got to stop. I think there's a healthy way to have these discussions about things because I think there's a rational paranoia in a lot of sense as well, too. There's no trust. That's the main thing. And I think a lot of people need to try and find that in a sense. And I think it needs to start with both parties coming to the table clean. I mean, when you're able to talk to me as a person and we might have deciding or different views on some things, you could send me some stuff as well too. You give me the time to have a discussion with you where we both bring up some points about some things that make us think a little bit too. That's the whole point of conversation.
It is. It is. And the one thing I do want to plug on the air is not my own book, but somebody else's book. And I want to say it because I want your listeners, your viewers to know about it. There's a book by another a fellow philosopher of mine. His name is Qasim Qassam, the coolest name ever. Last name is spelled Cassam, called Conspiracy Theories. It's a very short paperback, very readable. And so if people want to understand what conspiracy theories are, why people believe them, what the problems are with conspiracy theories, what are the kind of the history of conspiracy theories, that's an excellent book to start with. People talk about, conspiracy theories are very black and white, and there's, how do you know what to trust, what to read? This is a very good book about conspiracy theories because it really digs in, I think, to what the deficit is of conspiracy theory thinking.
Would you
And
call
one
me
of
a
the very,
conspiracy theorist?
well, I don't know. I'm gonna read the book and see if you fit the criteria, right? Because he makes the point early on in the book that there are true conspiracies. There are things that, turned out to, actually be actual conspiracies that people didn't take seriously at the time, but that's different from conspiracy theories. And the I don't want to spoil the book, but I'll say this, that the issue comes back to this issue that you raised about trust. If you're willing to trust, if you're a conspiracy theorist, right, and you're willing to trust the less likely hypothesis because it might be true over the hypothesis with much more evidence because you're suspicious of it, that's a problem, right? Why are you, because the conspiracy theorists can't say, oh, they don't trust anybody. Yes, they do. They're trusting the person who's saying, connect the dots, find this and that. One other thing I want to send you to read, fascinating article. That's something that I knew nothing about because I don't know, if you're 24, you probably have played video games. I don't play video games. I don't know anything about video games. But I read this article by this guy who was a gamer, and he was interested in QAnon and in how it is that people find patterns in random data. That is, patterns where, let me be clear, there's nothing to it, but you'll find something that looks like it was, intentional. And as a gamer, he makes it clear how this is completely possible. So, that's another thing. I've written a little bit about the topic of conspiracy theories, not very much, but I've written a little bit about it. And it's a fascinating topic to me because in my mind, the problem is the kind of double standard of evidence, right? If you're willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the people who have got the crumbs, and you're not willing to listen to the people who've got the loaf, that's the trouble, right? Because then is evidence really making a difference, right? If is it really changing your mind? I'm all about the idea that, again, I wrote a book on this, Scientific Attitude, that the evidence is the thing that should compel you to change your mind.
Yeah, I kind of have the idea that if you have a party of 10-year-olds or 10-year-olds, and then there's one that's 9 years old, he's got to come to the party too. You can't just make it exclusively for 10. I don't think you should ever dismiss or you should ever completely erase or take out a certain probability, even if it's a 0.1% chance. I'm not going to look at that as like that's the 100% answer and all the other ones are no. I'm just going to say, well, let's keep that on the deck. You want to have kind of more cards in your hand in this aspect of things as
But,
well too.
but you don't want to have somebody make you feel foolish, though, for hanging on to that one small thing because it might be true. I mean, think about that. Isn't that what they're doing with climate change? Isn't
Well,
that what some of the climate deniers are saying? Yeah, but aren't you telling me that although it's a 1 out of 1 million chance,
I've been labeled a
it's
conspiracy person from
possible I'm right?
I've been labeled a conspiracy person from the people that I have on. I've had from both sides, people that are skeptics and been in the Skeptical Inquirer, and I had Michael Shermer
Yeah.
on and everything. That I have had people from
Now
both
he's a
sides.
pal. What did he say?
What about what?
Does he think you're a conspiracy theorist? Did he
I
say
never
so?
asked him that question. I think we just kind of
Okay.
had more of like a
Yeah.
I don't know. There's times where he put his hand like this on his forehead, and I was like, I feel like I'm
he's
giving
a
him a headache.
very
He's
he's
a
a
great guy.
terrific guy. I mean, his podcast is great. And
Yeah.
talk about skeptical. I mean, he founded the journal. That's terrific.
But
Well, you're talking to the right people.
I feel like for some people, like people only want to look at a couple episodes, not the 1,000 that I have to search up certain names. They look at the past couple ones, and I like to joke around and entertain like this dark cabal. I did say the Illuminati was real when he was on. He goes, "What? Like dark shrouded cloaks?" And I'm like, not dark shrouded cloaks. My idea of it is just a bunch of people who found a way to cheat the system, who make it work in their favor in a sense, like Google, like Disney, like all these giant corporations that seem to be dominating the market slowly but surely. In a sense, they're grabbing for more power than we intended them to have. That's
Why
my
does that?
idea of Illuminati.
Okay, but you realize that what other people mean by the phrase Illuminati is very different, in that you're making a huge leap with no evidence.
Okay, that might be why I'm a conspiracy person.
but
um,
see exactly what we were talking about, though, right? Don't give more credence to the thing with less evidence.
Well, it's just like you said a second ago about are you gonna be ridicule? Are you worth being ridiculed for just holding on to that little bit of thing? I go, well, I don't think you should really honestly care what other people think about you in a sense either. If I get labeled a conspiracy person because of a friend that I have that's a flat earther, that's on those people. It's not gonna harm me, and I'm not
Yeah,
gonna lose a minute of sleep
I
over it.
shouldn't have said, I shouldn't have made it a point of not wanting to be ridiculed. I What I should have said is that's an easy way to end up believing something that's not true.
You can't let it sink the ship of your mind, and you also can't let people rent your own headspace. There's no two ways about it. I think you need to decipher life through yourself, and I don't think you should cut off any connection to anything, but I also don't think you should run with the one that best fits your ideal description of what you want. You have to invite things in that you're not going to like. The world's messy.
And evaluate them,
Yeah, the world's
right?
messy. You're not going to get everything you want.
Have you ever read Socrates?
A little bit, yeah.
To me, that is the cure. That is, you read Plato's dialogues, they're readable. I mean, they're dialogues, they're meant to be accessible. That's when I teach philosophy, that's where I start, because he questions everything. Socrates, people know Socrates is a character in Plato's dialogue. Socrates never wrote anything, but Socrates was a real person. He was Plato's teacher. But I'm saying that, that. I'm saying it for the benefit of your audience who may not know it, some people.
I have a
But
friend who's she does a YouTube channel where she puts up Plato quotes constantly. So
yeah,
we've had in-depth
yeah.
discussions on it.
So Socrates questions everything, and he maintains that he doesn't really know anything. And to me, that's a very good attitude, right? Because he's, what did I say earlier? Open-minded but skeptical. He's willing to talk to anybody, any hypothesis, but then he'll evaluate it. And by the end of the dialogue, it's usually, there's not much left to it. But, it's building up that skepticism that's true skepticism. That's not just skepticism in favor of the things that you don't, against the things you don't want to believe. And then you're going to be really easy on the things you do want to believe. It's skepticism, especially about the things that you want to believe, because that's where you're most likely to make a mistake, right? We've all got that cognitive bias that tells motivated reasoning that tells us, oh yeah, that's what I want to be true. So now I'm going to engage in confirmation bias and go out and read as many things as I can that show me that, yes, that thing that I wanted to believe is true, it's actually true. You've got to read people who disagree with you.
Yeah.
And I think the place to start is Socrates. I'm awfully sorry I have to run, but I've got another show coming up, and I need to.
We got to wrap it anyway. But Lee, I want to give you a chance. Where can people find you? Twitter, any social media websites, links, anything, and your books as well too. People could check out.
The best way to find all of those things is my website, LeeMcIntyreBooks.com. It's got links to my books, to my appearances, to my other work that I've done. Contact information, just kind of anything that you want to find there. Again, LeeMcIntyreBooks.com. And thank you very much for having me on the show. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.